Hi everyone. For those of you not on our first intro call a couple of weeks ago, my name is Melinda and I am a UI designer here at Phase 2. I've been here for about a year and come from a background of training, project management, and visual design. I firmly believe that modular design is the best approach in creating cohesive, flexible, and efficient digital experiences. And since DSM helps facilitate this, I'm really excited about your adoption of it. So now let me touch on what I will cover today. I'm going to start by talking about design principles, what they are and how to go about establishing them, Sketch and how best to use it in conjunction with DSM, the library structure of DSM and best practices there, and finally some general and quick recommendations on your sketch files and DSM based on what I've seen so far. So now let's get started. It's important for a design system to have a set of guiding principles that will govern decisions your team is going to make. This is where design principles come into play. So what are they exactly? Essentially, design principles are agreed upon phrases, guidelines, or rules that can be used during the design and decision-making process to ensure your system as a whole remains consistent and dedicated to its purpose. On the right, you can see some examples of some reputable companies' design principles. For Airbnb, it's unified, universal, iconic, and conversational. For Salesforce, it's clarify, efficiency, consistency, and beauty. Here's another example of a company's design principles. I want to note that principles can be phrased in different ways. On the last slide, you could see that there were single words, while in this example, they are short phrases. Either way works perfectly fine. So when determining your guiding principles, you want to focus on terms that are authentic and genuine, practical and actionable, unique, and relatable and memorable. I highly recommend looking at other examples out there to get inspiration for what could make up your principles if you decide to make them. So now let's jump into our sketch review. I will note that some of these slides will likely have content that you already know. However, I think it's important to make sure we're all aligned and on the same page, and I think it will really be a good level set for everyone. So to get started, let's talk about our symbol setup. Let's take a card as an example for how to structure your symbols in Sketch. I pulled this card from your PH Design System sketch file and simplified it a bit. This card has multiple nested symbols built into it, which allows for more flexibility in potentially using these pieces across other components. The first thing to pay attention to is your text styles. Text styles are incredibly important, not just in your symbols, but also in general. So make sure all of your text in your symbols have text styles linked to them. In this example, you can see the header text, which is styled as an H4. In this card should be linked to the style properly, and this is represented by the first example on the top right. The bottom two examples show when the text has either been altered from the current style, which is indicated by the asterisk next to the name, or it has no style linked at all. You want to avoid the bottom two. Additionally, all text styles associated with components need to be saved before pushing the component to the DSM. The second thing to think about are saved layer styles. Layer styles allow you to keep the core component consistent, but create customization based on use case. So in this example, you can see that nested symbol of the header has a layer style with a gray background. Additionally, it has an icon with a layer style tied to it. Icons can really benefit from layer styles in that they can change colors, outlines, and so forth. Speaking of icons, for icons, probably the most important thing to note is making sure all of your icons are the same sizes, and those sizes should be standardized. So, such as 24 by 24, 40 by 48, and so on. Usually numbers that have a square aspect ratio and are divisible by 4. Another tip for icons and vectors in general is not to resize by dragging. Instead, be sure to use the actual scale tool in Sketch. I found that Sketch is not the best when it comes to handling vector graphics like icons, so you may want to create them elsewhere and bring them in. Lastly, an interesting nuance is making sure your icons don't bleed past the artboard. Often, depending on your border settings, when you create a new symbol from an icon, it will automatically bleed off the artboard. Usually this is fine, however, for the DSM web view specifically, they will appear cropped. They are not actually cropped though, considering when you download them from the web view, they're not cropped. However, it's just something to note if you're relying heavily on that web view to showcase your design system. I can't talk about symbols without mentioning overrides. One of the great benefits of symbols is the ability to override their properties. In each symbol, you have layers, and those layer names and order will show up under overrides when you use the symbol, which you can see on the right-hand side. So in this example, since we have several nested symbols within this card, there are several override panels broken up by a light gray line in the inspector. The header symbol, which is nested in this card, has the icon, header text, and background organized top to bottom, so that the topmost item is at the top, then the second item is the second, and so on. And you can see that in the example in the bottom left. Additionally, besides layer order, naming is very important. Keeping them consistent and descriptive helps. So saying header, subheader, and body as the label text, both in the text box itself as well as the layer name, work well for simplicity and ease of use. The textiles, however, should be named something more descriptive and dev-friendly, which I'll speak a little more to coming up here. Since we just talked about overrides, let's talk about a feature that makes them work really well called Smart Layout. Smart Layout was something that was released by Sketch not too long ago. What's great about it is that it seems to work well and you don't have to rely on multiple third-party plugins that can sometimes cause issues or not work consistently. Smart Layout allows you to maintain the padding and spacing between layers in a symbol when editing its overrides. Once you've set up Smart Layout, a symbol instance will automatically resize when its overrides are changed. You can see in this example here that when I edited the text, it automatically increased the card in height to account for that additional text while maintaining the original padding in between elements. I also want to note, in order to do this, all groups in nested symbols should have the Smart Layout applied as vertical top to bottom, and all text boxes should be set to auto height. You can also use Smart Layout in other ways with different settings. This is just one example and one that I found to be very useful. As I mentioned briefly before, nested symbols are a great way to improve your overall workflow with symbols. Not only do they save time, but they also speak to the larger methodology of atomic design by essentially nesting your atoms into your molecules into your organisms, and so forth. In this example, we have two different footer states for this card we've been working with. By having these, it allows to still have one card, but can be quickly customized for content. It's important to note to make sure that all the variations of your nested symbols are the same size. And speaking of sizing, when resizing symbols, we recommend utilizing Sketch's built-in feature, Resize. For icons specifically, it's best to always set them to fixed size. Additionally, when you have elements that should stick in two particular sides of a component, the pin to edge feature works really well too. Although built-in features like Smart Layout and resizing can help in making responsive components, it is worth noting that having specific variations made for each major breakpoint in screen size can be very beneficial. It gives you full control of what components will look like come handoff to development. From my own experience, I think having 3 breakpoints of small, medium, and large is a really great starting place. I know you'll likely go more in depth about naming in a later session, but I wanted to touch on it because it's one of the most important aspects to basically everything. So when considering naming conventions for components in a design system, it's important to prioritize consistency, clarity, and meaning. So for this, I'm starting with 4 main areas to talk about: colors, textiles, layer styles, and components. And in each of these, I have a structure and examples of that structure. So for colors, it's use, then variation. So for example, primary default or secondary dark. Textiles is a little more complex and they're a little more of an outlier just because of the amount of properties needed. So an example structure for textiles would be category, then use, then size, then style, and then alignment. Examples would be H1, reverse, large, center, or body, default, small, bold, left. Next is layer styles. Example structure would be category, then use, then variation. So examples would be fill, primary, hover, or shadow, high. Lastly, for components, structure would be category, then use, then size, then variation. Examples might be button, primary, large, hover, or card, media, medium, default. Hopefully you can see some consistency in the structure order for each of these. Most of them have category, then use as the base directories to start. I want to note that sometimes a property isn't applicable or necessary, so it's okay to omit particular property values in specific instances. For example, the shadow layer style doesn't need as much as the fill layer style. Now, here are some general recommendations for naming things, both in Sketch and DSM. If following the atomic structure, adding a letter label to each component can really help quickly identify categories represented. So for example, A for atom, M for molecule, and O for organism. Use all lowercase letters, separate words with hyphens or forward slashes, and follow an order of operations type of structure for your naming. Avoid using numbers or symbols, words that describe visual characteristics like colors, and focus on the component's role. And lastly, to add visual indicators, such as little emojis in the overrides, for example. When editing a layer name, you want to press Control, Command, and Spacebar in order to get your little emoji window to pop up to add things like a pencil for text or a paint palette for color. I also wanted to briefly touch on plugins for Sketch because they can play a significant role in streamlining your work. I want to note that plugins can be amazing but can potentially cause some issues. Just be aware of this when you install new ones and that you may need to disable or even uninstall them if you run into problems with Sketch. Additionally, these are not direct recommendations from InVision. These are ones I have personally found to work well in improving my efficiency. So first there's Stark, and Stark allows you to check the color contrast ratio of your designs right within the application itself without having to go to another accessibility resource online, like WebAIM, for example. There's also Artboard Manager, which allows you to move your artboards around and automatically maintain consistent spacing and alignment between them. Renamement, which is really helpful for batch renaming things like symbols or layers. There's Sketch Measure, which is a really cool tool for when you need an annotated screen design image, for example. They also have other features, but I will note that using InVision's Sync plugin within Craft allows developers to inspect your designs directly in a browser without having to go into Sketch itself. And I would highly recommend doing that rather than making static images with annotations on them. However, it does depend obviously on your general workflow and what tools you use. And lastly is Symbol Organizer. I use this regularly. It organizes my symbol artboard so I don't have to manually, which really helps. And of course, there's Craft, which is made by InVision. If you haven't taken advantage of all of the plugins, you definitely should. It has 6 powerful plugins built into it, and those are Sync, Prototype, DSM, Data, Stock, and Freehand. I use Sync, DSM, and Data regularly, as well as the others, but those are the 3 I use the most. Sync is a great way to sync your designs to your InVision prototype with the ability for your dev team to inspect designs, as I mentioned earlier. And Data is great for generating real content for your designs, like text, so you don't have to use Lorem Ipsum or rely on another plugin. You can manage the individual plugins via the Craft Manager for really easy updating. If you want to learn more about Craft, I would go to the website, which is invisionapp.com/craft. So now let's move on to your library. Let's determine the most effective and efficient way to structure your documentation, styles, and UI elements within DSM's organizational hierarchy. So DSM contains 3 style-based folders that have their own nuances. These are colors, textiles, and layer styles. Some key takeaways for these and in general are to organize by use, then purpose, align with developer naming conventions, and when starting to build your DSM, start with these 3 first and then move on to icons and then more complex components. Speaking of components, here is the recommended structure for organizing your components in the DSM. First, you want to start with category, such as actions, and then you drill down into component, such as a button. Then you drill down further to the variation of that component, such as primary or secondary. And then you drill down even further to the state of that component, such as default or hover. With the live component embed feature, it can unlock the ability to group various states of a component together under a componentized folder. In addition to this, it may be helpful to upload things like page templates or larger elementals like breakpoints, column grid layouts, and standard spacing values to make for quick and consistent wireframing and UI design. Documentation is key to a successful design system. If you put yourself in the shoes of a new member on your team, on your product team, would they know how to get started, for example? My rule of thumb is that you can never have too much documentation. Some key takeaways or benefits of documentation is that it allows your team to understand how to use specific design patterns. It also adds a level of accountability for everyone, and it creates a culture of consistency and collaboration, which enables higher efficiency and less friction between groups. When creating documentation for the first time, it's important to answer the following questions. What is it? When to use it? When not to use it? Where to use it? And rules for how to use it. On the right here, you can see an example of some documentation on button usage rules for apartments.com's DSM, which is called Motor. I think this is a really great example of documentation for a component. So, where to begin with documentation? Here are some key places to start with your documentation. Obviously, documenting specifics around how to use a component is very important, but it's also important to include information on other areas, such as overall voice and tone, grammar, and accessibility, as I kind of mentioned before. But for a good, just general starting place, you may want to just start with these three areas and what would maybe fall under each of these. So, using the system, governance, and styles and components. As I briefly mentioned earlier, I think it's always important to glean insight from others. In this case, looking at other companies' DSMs, asking questions like how are they organizing them? What sort of documentation do they have? How in depth are they going? So you can get a really good feel for what others are doing and what may actually work for you. So I would recommend taking a look at these on your own. Additionally, I would highly recommend looking at other popular and successful design systems out there. So lastly, I want to jump into some quick and basic recommendations that I have made on your sketch files that you sent over as well as your DSM. Here are some recommendations for your DSM as it is currently. First is consider adding overall design principles and accessibility under your foundation section. Add rules and guidelines for how to use everything. Add layer style, since I didn't see that there. Simplify and make naming conventions more consistent. So, for example, use all lowercase letters and include hyphens between words. Refrain from using color names in your colors and avoid adding numbers to your names, as some examples. Also, group your buttons together. I noticed that primary, secondary, and tertiary were all separated. Consider adding a layout section and move the vertical spacing values into there instead of under where it is now, which is under prototype. And lastly, change your icon sizes to a more standardized size, like 48 by 48 instead of 50 by 50, which it is now. And now here are some recommendations for your sketch files. You may want to consider consolidating and limiting the number of folders in your Google Drive. Additionally, consider merging some of the files and using pages within Sketch to add more content in each file rather than separating everything out into separate individual files. Consider adding standard spacing values and column grid templates as symbols in your PH design system file. Be sure all naming is consistent, and it could also be simplified. So right now you have DSM, 3 links, P1, inactive disabled, 1 left. You may want to change that to link disabled left as a good example for a symbol. Consider utilizing Smart Layout, which would allow for components to easily resize based on symbol overrides. All files could use a consistent page structure. Some pages I found were unnamed. Some have the screen size in their names. Some have components in their names, and so on. If you're wanting to use DSM as a single source of truth for all files, I would say all files except for your PH design system file. You should refrain from having symbols built into them directly to avoid confusion and to really make sure that your DSM is your single source of truth. And lastly, move foundational elements like card base into other areas like layer styles. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you in our second session coming up.